My name is Trisha Lee. I'm the Distinguished Professor of the College of Communication and also the GCIP Director. If you don't know where it is, it's on the top of NCC here. So basically today I think it's our great honor to have the open talk and invited the very well-known professors specializing in international communication, Prof.Daya Thussu. Professor Thussu currently is working as the international communication professor at the Hong Kong Baptist University. At the same time, he's also the president of ICCA, which is the thousands of members globally. It's called International Association of Media and Communication Research. And I think today it's our great honor to have him here to share insights. And then he has two very important books. Of course, he edited 20 books. So these two he is going to share with us. The first one is International Communication, Continuity and Change. And he just told me the secret that next year he will update the 4th edition, particularly adding the chapter about AI. Yeah, thinking about information weaponization, this kind of issue. And the new book is called Changing Geopolitics of Global Communication. That's also the topic he's going to share with us. And that's thinking about different perspectives, not just the Western perspective of global communication, but also how influence of BRICS and like China, Russia, and India, and shaping the perspective about what is international communication. And also he particularly focusing on the development of digital infrastructure, commerce, and different domains, especially shaped by the technologies and politics. Okay, without further ado, let's give Professor Thussu a very big hand.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Lin, for inviting me. It's indeed a great honor and privilege to be speaking in this very prestigious and very old university. My first visit in person to Taiwan. I've done some talks online, but first time here in person. The topic for today's talk is about geopolitics of global communication, based on my recent book, which came out last year. And I'm very happy to announce that a Mandarin edition of that book is coming out very shortly by the CUC Press, Communication University of China Press. It's in production. I've done the foreword for the Mandarin edition. It'll be out hopefully before end of the year. I must also mention that my background is not in communication studies. I have a PhD in international relations. I have a master's in history and in politics. So I'm coming to this field from slightly different perspective. And this, the book I'm going to talk about is my most international relations book with a communication focus. What I will do is talk briefly about how global geopolitics is defined, how it is communicated, and the kind of domination of certain parts of the world, certain countries, certain corporations based there are still very dominant, but there is also a very significant change in terms of how that traditional domination is being challenged. And within that, my focus would be what's happening in the digital space. So let me start. Oh, what's happening here? There's something on Mandarin on the screen which I cannot read. Sorry. Okay, thank you. So that should work now. Thank you so much. So this is the book which was published last year. Actually, it has 2025 on its cover in its kind of publishing year, but actually it's 2024, actually out in 2024. What is special about this is the first book-length study which directly connects geopolitics with global communication. Because as many of you know, that there is a kind of territoriality in our university systems. People who do international relations do not do a lot of communication, and vice versa. People who do communication don't do a lot of international relations. So this is really a first attempt to explicitly link geopolitics and global communication. It's published in a very prestigious series called Communication and Society, which is a Routledge series, whose series editor is Professor James Curran. Some of you may know his work. He's a very distinguished media historian, a former colleague at Goldsmiths College, where I used to teach in London. So what it does is examines the changes and continuities in US-led global geopolitics and how it is communicated. Because that, in fact, the whole idea of geopolitics is a very European idea. It has a very strong colonial connotation, etc. But the focus of the book, and that is the title of the book also, is the change. And that change in a macro sense has come from what is often described as the rest. So I'll explore that rest in a little detail in a minute. But the fact that there is a change, and since the book was published, we have seen that change in all its different manifestations. For example, in the trade war, the US and China war, for example, and one could say convincingly that actually US had to take a step back to accommodate Chinese interests. So that's an indication of how much has changed. But before I go talk about change, I want to remind you of the continuities. And that continuity has a long history in terms of global communication. If you look at the history of global communication, beginning from 19th century imperial, cabling of the world to contemporary international communication, the Western domination is very well documented. But today you have a new geopolitical actors rather, and these are those hugely powerful global conglomerates, as you see on in this picture, this illustration rather, from Meta to Google to Microsoft to Alibaba. These are now actual international players in the ways they affect international relations. And it is creating a lot of concern, especially in the Western world, in democracies, that this is actually undermining democracy. There's so much power being wielded by unelected and hugely powerful corporations. A good illustration of that is this recent book. Some of you may know this book. If you haven't, you should consult it. It's an interesting book by a well-known public intellectual. And she wrote this, I think it was 24 or 23, I can't remember exactly. She simply called it The Tech Coup. How to save democracy from Silicon Valley. So, some other scholars and commentators now speak of all kinds of structures in place which are making this power of the digital extremely, extremely important to analyze. In my book, there is a whole chapter which I called Digital Imperialism. In fact, there is a kind of contrast between digital empowerment versus digital imperialism. Others have talked about data imperialism. Some speak of data cartels. So young people may not know this, but it's worth reminding that in the 19th century, there was a news cartel, news agencies cartel. A French, a British, and a German news agency divided the world amongst themselves. All the international news would come from Reuters or a German and a French company. So it's a new version of those cartels. And as most of our data is in these clouds, and just to remind you, they are not God, created, they are human creation. So some scholars talk about cloud empires. And then AI comes into the picture, and suddenly there's a huge debate about what it will do or is already doing to every aspect of our life, including communication. I call it American intelligence. And here you have the top 5 companies. I'm sure most of you know these. And they are, as you know, for example, Microsoft has been in the business much longer. People used to talk about Microsoft monopoly in the 1980s. And Apple and Google. And the new player in all this is NVIDIA, which is speaking in Taiwan. I should remind you, going to have a huge investment in this country. So, in every aspect of global communication and how it is mediatized and how it is understood and debated, there is a very well researched, documented history of a certain kind of domination. The format might have changed, but fundamentally it has not changed. Except that there has been in recent decades a visible shift in power relations. Sometimes we label it as the rise of the rest. And I want to talk a bit about that with a focus on a particular grouping called the BRICS countries. Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. In my view, they represent a serious challenge to the dominant structures. Now, I had the privilege to work on a big project on BRICS Media, which was based in Finland. It was a Finnish Academy supported project. And we did a lot of work on it, including these 3 books that we produced. 2 of these have my name on it because I was directly involved. And it was a project which looked at, we had teams in all the 5 BRICS countries, including in mainland China, and they were looking at specifically on journalism. That was the focus. And it was very difficult, as you would appreciate, because these are very different countries with very different levels of development, political systems, media systems, economic structures, etc. But there's also an interesting commonality. They are major non-Western nations. Right? And when the last book of this series came, there were lots of other journal articles and conferences, and we did a lot of work on it. BRICS Media Reshaping the Global Communication Order. It was published in 2021. So it was the COVID book. So when it was published, my friends and colleagues were saying to me, why are you flogging a dead horse? BRICS doesn't make sense. These countries are so desperately different. What is common between Brazil and South Africa? India and China, you can't have more contrasting countries. But I was, and colleagues working on this, there's something to it. It's not just a made-up phrase by a Goldman Sachs executive. So rather than disintegrating, in fact, BRICS has expanded. So now people speak of BRICS Plus. So just by way of little background, because some of you may have never heard of it or known about it, because this is not fashionable in the Western discourse, and you are, I would assume, mostly exposed to that discourse. BRICS was actually a Russian idea. It was BRIC, Brazil, Russia, India, China. And it emerged from the concern that after the US economic crisis, as younger people may not remember, 2007, 8, 9, where other major capitals, people were discussing, we can't depend on the vagaries of American housing market. So we got to think of alternative structures. The idea came from Russia. But then China appropriated that idea, telling the West, look, we are not the only emerging powers, challenges to you. These are these other people, the Russians, the Indians, the Brazilians, etc. And by Chinese insistence, South Africa was added, so it became BRICS. Chinese argument was, we need to have global representation. Africa is not represented, South Africa should be a member. South African economy is tiny in comparison to China's, for example. So it's remained BRICS until 2024, last year, when there was a sizable expansion. It doubled in size. Egypt joined, Ethiopia joined, Iran joined, United Arab Emirates joined, and this year Indonesia joined. In fact, Saudi Arabia and Argentina had also said they will join. And there was a change of regime in Argentina. In Saudi Arabia, is not sure they might join or not join. Maybe there was a phone call from Washington, it's very likely. But look at these countries again. They're important countries in their own region. And some of them, Iran, for example, is very important energy power. You already have Russia in the mix, arguably probably the second most important, not only energy power, but also sitting on fresh water and nuclear weapons and what have you. Now, Europeans have discovered that in the Ukraine crisis, that's more complicated than what they thought it was. And then you have partner countries, Belarus, Bolivia, Kazakhstan, Cuba, Malaysia, Nigeria, Thailand, Uganda, Uzbekistan, and Vietnam. Turkey is also queuing to come in. Now, I've highlighted two, again from an energy perspective. So, geopolitics is not about media and communication. That's a tiny part of it. You have to have more substantial discussion about why there is shift, right? Why certain countries get covered in a certain way and others don't. So both Kazakhstan and Nigeria, again, very rich resource countries. So is Indonesia, by the way. And then think of the original BRICS. You have China and India, two most sort of energy hungry nations on the planet. India is the largest major economy, in terms of growing very rapidly among the large economies. China is already the second largest. So I just wanted to get that context of BRICS, but at the heart of BRICS is China. It's the most important economy, and it has, as I said before, appropriated this idea and expanded it. So all these countries, you see, there is a direct or indirect Chinese involvement. Ethiopia, for example, which is where the African Union's headquarters is based, and that building was constructed by the Chinese money, by Chinese government. So China has a very clear, in my view, very clearly defined geopolitical project. And at the heart of it is, how do we reach the majority world? How do we reach the so-called global south? China still claims to be a developing country. Right? And the most prominent example of that is BRI, which many of you know, Belt and Road Initiative, the world's largest development project. And as you see on this map, it has a maritime connection as well as land-based connectivity. As you see here, railroads, oil pipelines, gas pipelines, ports, etc., etc. So we're talking here of, in my understanding, and I've been studying this for 30 plus years, there's no other project of this magnitude, of that ambition, ever undertaken in human history. And it's going on since 2013. So this is how Chinese official media commemorated 10 years of BRI. As you see, the figures are astonishing: $2 trillion, 1,000 projects, 150 plus countries involved, many international organizations involved. And when you're investing in all these 150 countries, you're providing the infrastructure, and then you're also giving them the software. So you've got the hardware, now you use our television channels, now you use our programming, etc., etc. So it is, a lot of these projects, by the way, are not working efficiently. There are numerous cases, in Sri Lanka, for example, in Pakistan, in Cambodia, where they have not worked, right? And there are many more. But just look at the ambition, the geographical reach, and the numbers involved. Actually, Italy was the only G7 country which had joined it briefly and then withdraw. Brussels, from both Brussels pressure and Washington. And also to say, in terms of the BRICS thing, India is the only major country in the BRICS or the developing world which is not part of BRI. Because some of the BRI projects, for example, the most prominent project is China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which is like billions of dollars already in operation. Some of the projects operate in an area which is disputed between two countries. So any government in New Delhi cannot openly say it's okay. They might be losing out because there's so much commerce and money to be made. So the focus has been on the global south, and there are here are some examples for you to think about. These are undersea cables. So I mentioned cables earlier in terms of 19th century. The reason I'm speaking in a language which is my third language, and most of you understand what I'm saying, is that there was a 19th century British imperialism. Right? Their language is the global language. So now you have all these undersea cables where the Chinese investment is profound. and growing. So China, as you know, is not just operating in these ways, working all over the world. But in the developed part of the world, it is finding a lot of resistance for political reasons, for ideological reasons, or just commercial reasons. But in the developing world, it's a different story. And that is impacting the whole geopolitics of development. So development is also a very interesting kind of Western project. Our NGOs will go and sort out your poverty. They've been doing it for 50 years, right? The Chinese are saying, we will build you a port. We'll make money, but you'll have port there. So if you're sitting in Bangladesh or Kenya, and a very well-meaning Norwegian guy comes to you and says, we're going to open a school for you, and we're going to teach your daughters how to use smartphones. And the Chinese say, okay, we're going to build you a railway station, railway line. I don't think there's much contestation. So it is having a very serious impact. Here are a couple of recent publications which not only identify it, but discuss it in some detail. I would strongly recommend these. The digital part of this BRI is particularly relevant for communication. And here again, China is very much ahead of its rivals. For example, its satellite systems all over the developing world. It's already on 6G. I have a home in London and 5G doesn't work very effectively. Okay? So there's this technological shift which people don't, in the Western capitals, didn't identify with China. They were going to copy our things. Right? That's a serious kind of error. And China is doing all that, but its version of what geopolitics is about is not very effective because it has a problem with how it communicates. Here are a couple of examples of that problem. This is a recent book. You may know this author. He also wrote a very well-known book called Charm Offensive, which a colleague in Tsinghua reversed and says it's actually charm defensive because we are defensive. We don't have an offensive approach. We have a defensive approach. This came out recently, I think 2 years ago, about focus is on Asia in this book. Beijing's global media offensive. So it's trying to, so once you have the infrastructure in place, you say, okay, now you watch CGTN, we'll give you for free. As we've given you satellites, now you have to use our software. But Americans have been doing it for 70 years. And then data. TikTok, very good case in point. Even more significant and unfolding as we speak is the revolution in artificial intelligence and how China has fundamentally challenged the status quo by what I call providing affordable AI to the developing world. This was a recent cover in The Economist magazine, China's lean, mean AI machine, and the reference was to DeepSeek. Which was a shock to a lot of people. And unlike the American world, this is open. They're giving it free. So you probably saw this on X. Microsoft, we got good for $80 billion. Meta, we are good for $65 billion. DeepSeek, we are good for our $5.5 million. So, obviously, quite a serious challenge to the established order. Now, in the geopolitical realm, this debate about AI is framed in a certain way. It is framed, broadly speaking, democratic versus authoritarian AI. And here are some examples. This is a report which was published by Freedom House. Some of you may know Freedom House, very important think tank, kind of campaigning organization, if you like, an arm of the American foreign policy, if you are more critical. Ensuring AI advances, that it advances internet freedom, and there are whole details about what it will do to protect and promote internet freedom. Okay. This is one of many such publications. As against what the other guys are doing. This is a report from NED, some of you may know, National Endowment for Democracy, which has been really got a very bad kind of treatment from the current administration. Manufacturing deceit, how generating AI supercharges information manipulation. It's implied that information manipulation is done by other party. We don't do that. Despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary, detailed in my book, with 40 pages of references. So, this is how it's framed. Right? It's straightforward, it's black and white, it works, it makes good media headline, and unfortunately, currently people don't read beyond headlines, so it's fine. So outside the West, the debate is slightly different. And that's my focus with this development with Chinese characteristics. This was a recent book which came out in the United States. It's a very interesting kind of summary of what the issues are in relation to China's globalization. Acquiring global influence via infrastructure development and digitalization. And it sums up the main issues rather well. First is, this is a development project which is state-led. It's not done by Oxfam or Save the Children or USAID. It's done by the government. And that government has exemplary record of eliminating extreme poverty. A generation ago, China had the largest number of people living in extreme poverty on the planet. Never in human history, 700 plus million people have been raised out of poverty in one generation. There's no record in history. China has done it. Now that doesn't register in Washington, Brussels. As I said before, they've been trying to claiming to reduce poverty for the last 60 years, 70 years. But if you're in New Delhi, if you're in Dhaka, if you're in Ethiopia, it's a very different reverberation, very different understanding. That is the rest. Robust digital hardware, supply chains and powerful software. Global South as priority, already indicated that. Threatening Western aid policies, Cold War 2.0. Further exaggerated by what Mr. Trump has done, by saying we're going to basically end foreign aid or substantially stop, including organizations as strong as USAID. So as a result, what China is seen in the geopolitical realm as a systemic rival. This is not my phrase, this is the EU phrase, European Union's phrase.
What does it mean systematic?
It's a different system. The next slide will explain it in more detail. This is another it might be very precise illustration of what the problem is in the Western mind. So, unlike the Soviet Union in 1950s and 60s and Japan in the 1970s and 80s, China is pursuing global leadership along all four dimensions. Biggest suppliers, largest market, toughest competitor, main geopolitical rival. China has lifted more people out of poverty faster than any society in human history, while differing sharply from established Western norms. We've been doing, as I said before, for 70 years. How could these guys do it? They're still processing. I think this really, in my view, it's from an American think tank. It's very precise. It gives you a very good summary of what the problem is. Now, this is happening also at a time, we talked about US, I talked about US a lot. I didn't talk about Europe as much. But Europe is in an even serious problem. I'll just give you two small examples to illustrate that point. The old world is dying and the new world struggles to be born. Does anybody know who that quotation is from? This is what's happened to our universities now. I've had asked this question 20 years earlier, every hand would go. This is Gramsci. And the old world here, I mean Europe. Its foreign policy is, not to put too fine a point on it, quite messy. And the most important country in Europe is Germany. Right? And some of you would know, if you don't, you should, that every year there is an annual security conference in Munich. It's called Munich Security Conference. It was an American project, it's a Cold War project, but it always happens in Munich. In 2022, the theme of that conference was Westlessness. Westlessness, which might be a nice German word. In English it sounds very awkward. And the argument was, the key argument was that the world is not listening to us. So West is losing its control on the narrative. Last year, a very interesting book came out with that title by this chap, Samir Puri, who was former diplomat and executive, academic and entrepreneur. Now he's at Senate House in London. He's with a think tank. Westlessness, the great global rebalancing, which he expands this argument in much more detail. In France, they have had so many governments change in the last year. It's just, you feel like, who is in charge? So this is a well-known right-wing commentator in France who declared that Occident has lost. Add to that mix is Mr. Trump 2.0. This was the cover of Time magazine. He's back, he can sweep everything away. And as we know, a lot of things have already been swept away. At the same time, you have a kind of disruption in global trade, which in my memory, I don't remember happening in the last 30, 40 years. This was the headline in Foreign Affairs, one of the most influential journals, says the weaponized world economy. You also have a very different kind of geopolitics today. It's transactional. It's business. This was a cartoon in The Guardian, not long when Mr. Trump was visiting London. And they're talking about Gaza. And the British Prime Minister, very politely, as British people always are, now about recognizing a Palestinian state. Oh, you won't recognize it once we are done with it. It's going to be beautiful, a Rivera. I will own it. So it's become very businesslike, overtly so, unabashedly so. Because the reality TV star has been made President of the United States for the second time. The most important individual on the planet. And then you have something else happening. This was September in China. SCO Summit, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and you have three leaders, Russian, Indian and Chinese together. First time Mr. Putin traveled abroad. He wasn't arrested. And you probably know India is supposed to be close to the United States, the highest kind of degree of tariff imposed in the world, only country, India. So, I'm going to end with some kind of reflections on what is coming. Of course, it's speculation, but it'd be good to leave some space for discussion. A new geopolitics. This was again Foreign Affairs in August. This was a reflection on this US, Europe. You know, Mr. Trump said publicly that he's going to take over Canada and Greenland and what have you. And his vice president was at the Munich Security Conference and said things which are not acceptable in any decent diplomatic conversation to European leaders. So, weakening transatlantic alliance. Although there's a counter argument in Europe, they're saying because of Ukraine conflict, we are closer to America. The third argument is precisely because what's happening in Ukraine, Europe is going to be in a mess for another 10 years. Except European defense companies, they're doing very well. Most Europeans are not. Competing platform imperialism. So when China is expanding all these in all these areas of the world, it has its own version of internet. It has its own platforms. Right? So is there going to be a competition between two platforms, California versus Greater Bay Area, if you like? Digital Cold War and weaponization of information. There's a whole chapter on that in the book about Ukraine war especially, and how information has been weaponized by both sides and how effectively it has been done. That is going to get worse because now with new technology you can do a lot more and very, very effectively. Role of BRICS plus, I mentioned BRI, I mentioned SCO is little less known, but actually is also an important grouping. They have also expanded. Again, China is in the heart of these, all three organizations. So they are going to are already creating a new kind of global realignment of powers. And the final point is about the whole concept of geopolitics, which has a very Western, it was originally a German idea, which was associated with, fascism, etc., and post Second World War, a huge influence on the United States. So when these new players are emerging and exerting themselves, will there be a different kind of geopolitics, a de-Americanization of geopolitics, and how that is mediatized, how that is communicated in the world? And that's something, in the book I have a whole section about decolonizing both geopolitics and its communication. So I will stop there. I'm very happy to take comments and questions. Thank you for your attention.
As you mentioned about democratic AI and also authoritarian AI, so could you give us some examples and how actually the competition between the two that you observe in terms of the framework of your geopolitics competition?
Well, I said this is how it's framed, right? This is how it's framed in policy debates, mostly in the West. The Chinese are not saying we are authoritarian AI,
yeah,
right?
Of course.
They are saying we are more democratic because we are giving our platforms freely to countries in the global south, right? The point was how it is framed in dominant debates in the world, because those dominant debates emerge from certain parts of the world. In fact, in the book, I have a chapter about infrastructure, right? The pipes and the satellites and all that boring stuff. But what is new is there is a section in it about what I call intellectual infrastructure. The role of think tanks, the role of universities, role of media foundations, how they set the terms of debate. So this is a classic example of you juxtapose it as authoritarian versus democratic, right? So, think, for example, the inauguration of President Trump in February. You may remember in the first row on the seats behind the president, they were the CEOs of major companies, Meta, Google, Microsoft, etc. The cabinet was sitting behind them, which to my mind was a very clear manifestation of where actual power is, right? This is the most famous democracy in the world, right?
Yes.
So I think it is my concern, the way I framed it was that how it is framed, and I don't agree with that framing. I think it's not clear cut, because
What's your framing?
my framing is like it's more complicated than that,
I see.
right? So there are very deep, undemocratic characteristics of the way certain democratic countries operate, right?
Yes.
And there are, China is a one-party state, so it has a very different system of operating in the, not just AI, what about any subject. So I think one has to take a slightly more nuanced view. It cannot be binary, right? That's what my view was. There's actually, there are things in the Western model which are very effective, and they are not always democratic, but a lot of them are democratic. Similarly, in the so-called authoritarian model, it's not just about manipulation and information warfare. There's also, as I tried to indicate, a very important developmental aspect, right? So DeepSeek is a very good example of that. That's not to say they are not a commercial operation. They also make money. This is, that's inbuilt in their sort of DNA, if you like. But this either or, I'm, contesting that basically.
So it's the complexity.
Yes,
you
of course.
mentioned about so-called Western democracy and this kind of AI model. Still, you observe that not just the government, but also the platforms and the giants of technologies also play a very important part.
Of course.
And then maybe in the China's, we observe, because China has lots of technology, actually they can control in a more stay-on or lead. So it's easier for them to operate in a certain way that the government says so the platform will follow. So it's a very complex. It's not like a authoritarian or democracy
Yes.
in a way. Okay. So what's the impact? What's the your observation when it has been like around more than 10 years?
Yeah.
Any salient impacts of that kind of investment to the global south?
Well, you just have to look at the data. I mean, the book I mentioned that has a lot of detail in it, and there are a lot of publications, not by Chinese government. They have their own kind of story to tell, but even independent observers outside China, that this is the most global, most powerful infrastructure project in history, and of course it is increasing Chinese imprint around the world. So there are 150 countries involved in some way or the other. The only ones which are excluded are the Western nations, and India would be one major absence because of, as I said, political reasons, right? The India-Pakistan dynamic, border dispute, etc. And as I also said, many of these projects are not working very well. Right? There are issues about what they call debt dependency. So China is going, okay, we're going to build this for you, but now you have to pay us back. Right? So any project of that magnitude would have such sort of problems. But by and large, it is really, I'm not an expert on that particular subject, but my sense is, in terms of infrastructure, global infrastructure, especially in the global south, I would say it's very impressive. And therefore a long-term impact. So just for by comparison, think of the Marshall Plan. Young people may not remember this. This was the plan that the Americans introduced in Western Europe after the Second World War to rebuild Europe, Western Europe, not Eastern Europe, Western Europe. And that was in the 1950s. So we are in 2025. American imprint in Europe is profound. Foreign policy, very profound. So then magnify that, this was only in one particular geography of the world, which is Western Europe. Right? Multiply that by 20 times and cover the whole world. So common sense would say that the Chinese influence will grow all over the world. And that world is the global south, it's not in Europe. So it's a long-term project, right? It's been going on since 2013. A lot of people didn't know it unless they were studying it. Most people didn't know it existed. But now, as you see in Southeast Asia, for example, in South Asia, in parts of Africa, in Latin America, then people seem to realize, because these are boring things, right? They are about infrastructure and, bridges and nobody takes them seriously, but actually they are fundamental to how a power consolidates its position in different parts of the world. And that's exactly what it's doing, and I would say successfully.
And the next question, because you said there is some rebalancing of a geopolitical power.
Yes.
So it's not just Western dominance. So what is actually, changing or shifting to which direction, based on your observation?
Well, Mr. Obama had this phrase, which was that, we're moving to Asia, right? the shift to Asia is happening. This was some time ago.
Yes.
I think that is going to be in my view, that is the next, because this part of Asia, East Asia, is already developed. China had to deal with lots of problems, but it's moved to the very next level. If South Asia was to develop to that level, and India is actually at the heart of that, and India is growing very good speed. It's, as I said, one of the big economies, is the still fastest growing economy. It has a huge demographic advantage. So just think of the numbers again. 70% of Indians are below the age of 35. 70%. So do the maths. We're talking about 900 million people who are young.
Especially when we said it's an aging society everywhere, right? So you have
Yes, exactly. This is also happening in Africa. But Africa doesn't have the educational level, the democratic systems, the intellectual tradition, the universities, etc., that India has. So out of this 900 million, just say 10% go abroad. It's 90 million people. And then think of what's happening in Russia, what's happening in USA, what's happening in Europe, what's happening in Japan, what's happening in China even. So I think that shift is already happening. The latest is that the Russians have had a long discussion with the Indian government. They said, we need young people to come and work for us. And India has millions of people looking for work. So this is demographic. The other thing which is actually much more, in the long run, much more significant, and why China is so interesting in my view, is that this is not just, as a nation state, it is only, 75, 77 years old, 1949. I mean, you would dispute it in Taiwan, you say we are the Republic of China, but internationally, as a nation state, China is 1949. But as a civilization, it's pretty old, right? Same with India. 1947. But a civilization goes back a long time. So what happens if these civilizations become more powerful? What happens to the discourse? Because we've been told that knowledge comes from Europe. When that is challenged, what happens? So I think that's the point. The future is Asia. I have no doubt in my view in that. Because there are in fact, there's a very interesting argument which is about what is called the return of Asia. The argument is till the 18th century, majority of GDP in the world came from Asia. China was the top, India was second. Right? So it's a return of Asia. There was a period of colonial exploitation, that's over, and it's going to be. So that's the long-term project. Right? It's not media studies, it's like civilizational studies, it's a different view. But so I think that's the shift is, in my view, it'll take time, but it will happen. And if South Asia was to develop, then the whole region it's a very different story, because that's still a region with largest number of people living in poverty in the world, in absolute numbers, right? Because so if I say 900 million are young people, a lot of them are unemployed, right? So I think what has already happened in this part of Asia, if that was to happen in South Asia, it will change the world.
All right, so let's leave him up with that.
Thank you. Thank you.